This is a Patreon exclusive version of a talk I gave back on February 23rd entitled Becoming a Thousand Men, a Critique of Archetypal Interpretation. Usually we do this down in the classroom, and Chris Alderman would introduce me and we'd film it, but unfortunately our computer went on the fritz and we lost that recording. So I am doing the talk again today in the loft, and to nobody except to the camera. Hopefully this goes all right. And that way you folks who are following us on Patreon can see what I said. Okay, so let's start by me introducing myself. My name's Gil Greco. I'm the house manager at Gutenberg College. I graduated from Gutenberg College back in 2012 after I wrote my senior thesis on C.S. Lewis and Joseph Campbell, and I'm going to talk about both of them today. I also cook for the house, so I'll talk a little bit about cooking as an art as it relates to the discussion of literature and literary interpretation. My wife and I have we got married back in 2010, and now we have two boys, Linford and Wendell, and they live with us here at the college, and we really love doing what we're doing here. I should say that this is part of a series of talks that are about the intersection between Christianity and literature. The first week, Ron talked about some broader issues with understanding literature as it appears in the Bible. Second week, Ryan Carroll talked about the Exodus story and its importance to understanding what's going on in the rest of the biblical text. And I am sort of transitioning away from sort of purely biblical ideas, although I will say some things about how Christianity is affected by the interpretive scheme that we choose. And I'm talking more about literature in general. So today I want to introduce a bunch of concepts and give some language for the discussion sort of moving forward. Hopefully I can introduce some categories that'll be helpful as we move forward in this series. So let's get started. So this is Becoming a Thousand Men, a critique of archetypal interpretation. So we might start by asking, what is an archetype? So archetypes were developed by Carl Gustav Jung, who was a psychologist and a clinician. He was studied under Freud, and he's been very influential up to this day. If you're aware of the work of Jordan Peterson attributes a lot of sort of his understanding of things to Jung, and I'm going to talk about Dr. Peterson in a little bit. But an archetype was an idea that Jung developed to talk about basic structures of human understanding that we didn't have to learn. So we might think of how a child relates to its mother. A child that relates to his mother doesn't need to be taught, how to be a child to a mother. It just treats anybody who treats it with the sort of nurturing care that we associate with motherhood as if it were its mother. This is why you can have a sort of adoptive relationship. So even though there's no biological sort of tie between the two people, because the child sort of has these ingrained categories for what a mother is, it can sort of adjust and live with its adoptive mother just as if it had been its biological mother. And I think Jung is probably correct about the idea of an archetype. It's very similar to sort of in some ways, Plato's ideas of a form. Right, we sort of understand things even though we've never learned them. It's very, so it has to do with sort of these basic structures of human understanding that I think would be aligned with other thinkers that have gone through the ages. I think Reed would be very comfortable with this idea. In any case, the archetype is sort of what is the wiring that I need in order to understand and relate to something in a specific way in the world. The issue that I have with Jung, and that I might have with other practitioners who want to have sort of an archetypal, want to talk about archetypes in general, is very often they will want to enumerate what the archetypes are. And I'm a little bit hesitant to do that. I'm a little bit wary of Jung when he enumerates what all the archetypes are, because that comes back a lot to what you think sort of the important things in the world and how our most basic functionings and things like that are. So I'm comfortable with the idea of an archetype, but enumerating exactly what those are gets a bit trickier. So in order to talk about archetypal interpretation, which is a particular way of interpreting literature. So we're moving away from archetypes sort of as such in general and moving to archetypal interpretation, which I'm going to offer a critique of in this talk. I'm going to have us look at an archetypal scheme, and we're going to look at Joseph Campbell's archetypal scheme that he talked about in A Hero with a Thousand Faces. Then I am going to talk about why he had that scheme, and then I'm going to introduce several other archetypal schemes, and we're going to talk about what they have in common. After we talk about that, I'm going to offer the alternative that is proposed by C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and sort of their writings, and then I'm going to discuss how their alternative reveals certain problems with archetypal schemes, and then finally I will conclude with a few words about how all of what I've talked about relates to Christianity. So let's get started. So if you look over here, I've written down I think there are 16 stages of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Now, stages is a little bit misleading of a term. Stages, these things don't necessarily happen in order. When I wrote my thesis, I wrote about these stages, and I called them elements, because not every story is going to have all of these things happen in this order. And sometimes you have elements of these stories, some of these elements pop up in a story out of order. So it's helpful to think of them as elements rather than stages, because it sort of takes the expectation that there's some kind of chronology to these things out of what we're talking about. I will say I'm going to talk about some pop culture readings and things that will help us sort of flesh out what these things are. Hopefully I've picked things that are well known enough that you're going to know what's going on. At my talk, I actually asked people what things they knew about, and was prepared to sort of shift around what I was going to say in case, someone in the audience wasn't aware of who Harry Potter was. But given that there isn't an audience who can talk to me, I'm just going to go with what I've got, and hopefully you can sort of get the gist of what I'm saying, even if you're not familiar with the particular works that I'm talking about. But hopefully I've picked things that are well known enough. So let's talk about some examples of these, right? So you have the call to adventure. You have a character who is sort of going along in their life. It is usually sort of humdrum. Possibly it's not pleasant for them. And something comes along and lets them know that there is a bigger world out there and is inviting them to come to that bigger world, right? So if we think about Luke Skywalker from Star Wars, he has this sort of aspiration that he wants to leave the farm. He wants to go off to some kind of academy. And it's when he runs into Ben Kenobi that Ben Kenobi says, you need to become a Jedi and learn the ways of the Force. And Luke initially refuses that call, right? There's the refusal of the call. He's like, I've got too many responsibilities, I've got too much work that I have to do. But Ben is very adamant that he needs to do that. Ben would be an example of what we would call supernatural aid, right? He shows up and he's sort of the wise old man. You could think of Gandalf. You could think of, usually people will put Dumbledore sort of in this category, or you could think Hagrid if you're thinking sort of more straightforwardly to the story of Harry Potter. And then the hero has to cross the first threshold. So for Luke, he's going to Mos Eisley, and he has to get on the Millennium Falcon and leave, and that's how he sort of goes to that wider world. So if we think about Harry Potter, right, we have the call to adventure, which is Harry Potter gets his letter from Hogwarts saying that he's a wizard and that he needs to go. Now, in the case of Harry Potter, Harry is not the one who refuses. He sort of refuses by fiat, since his uncle refuses to sort of let these letters in, let the mail in, and they go off to, the island where they have the little cabin, and it's only when Hagrid shows up that Harry is allowed to sort of leave the Dursleys and go on to the wizarding world. And so crossing the first threshold, depending on how you want to break this down, that could be walking through the division between platforms 9 and 10, and he's off to sort of this magical world. You can think about Frodo, right? Frodo has, he sort of lived a comfortable life under the tutelage of Bilbo, and he is called to adventure by Gandalf. Gandalf tells him that he has to take the ring at least to Rivendell, and he is somewhat reticent to do that, but again, supernatural aid in the form of Gandalf comes along and helps him on his way. So then there are other motifs that sort of go through here. The belly of the whale, you might think of the trash compactor in Star Wars, or the devil's snare in Harry Potter. You have atonement with the Father. This is the end of Star Wars, Return of the Jedi. Luke Skywalker finally saves Darth Vader, and they sort of have an atonement there. Meeting with the goddess. This is when they're going to rescue Princess Leia, and he runs into her, right? And she's very pretty, and she says, you're too short for a stormtrooper. So Joseph Campbell's idea was that in any story that you look at, you can sort of see this structure or these elements sort of popping up everywhere you look. Now, sometimes stories don't have all of these elements. So, for instance, the magic flight is one that Campbell highlights, and he talks about how the story of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods is an example of the magic flight. He seems to imply that the rest of these sort of elements are implied in that story, but in a single telling of a single story, you might only get one element of these elements. Now, you'll notice that some of these are in blue, some of them are in green, and some of them are in red. And that's because in Campbell's breakdown of each of these elements, each of these belong to a sort of different phase of the story and of what Campbell thinks that stories are all about in the end. So let me write down the three sections, and then we'll talk about sort of why Campbell thinks they are what they are. So we have separation, we have initiation, and we have return. And in order to understand these three categories, we need to understand Campbell's metaphysics of the world. So, for Joseph Campbell, at some point in history, or not in history, in the distant past, we used to be part of what he calls the superconsciousness. And in his mind, there are a bunch of different ways of talking about this. So, for instance, in Eastern philosophy, they talk about the void. And in Joseph Campbell's minds, that's the superconsciousness. In Hinduism, they talk about Brahman, right? Sort of this what is the underlying structure of all of reality? That's the superconsciousness. Christians talk about it when they talk about the power of God. Everything comes out of the power of God and sort of diffuses back into the power of God. Physics would call this energy. So everything comes out of the superconsciousness, and everything eventually will return to the superconsciousness. And what has happened with human beings is, as we've emerged from the superconsciousness, we've fragmented into a bunch of different individual consciousnesses, and now the superconsciousness is our unconscious. And so what we want in order to become whole, according to Campbell, is to be integrated back into the superconsciousness. And the problem with that is that we really like being individuals, or we feel like we really like being individuals, although that contributes to a lot of sort of our psychological problems and neuroses and our feeling that we're not whole. And so what stories exist for is to sort of move us to this realization that we need to be reintegrated into the superconsciousness, and each of these elements is sort of telling a piece of that story, so that by telling ourselves stories, we can acquire the bravery that we need to sort of move forward in our quest to become reintegrate into the superconsciousness. So the call to adventure is, you might have a dream, or, you might even have customs that have been given to you by a medicine man or something that requires you to become more than you are, right? So you may be a young man in your own culture, and the issue is all of the local trappings of your individuality are preventing you from becoming part of the superconsciousness. So in order for you to become initiated and to gain enlightenment and to realize that what you need is to become part of the superconsciousness, the first step is for you to sort of leave home, to leave your sort of these assumptions that have plagued you through the beginning of your existence, slough off sort of your local beliefs and your individual beliefs and your individual biases, so that you can come to see that what you need is to be part of the superconsciousness. So if we think about Luke Skywalker, right? Luke Skywalker wants to become a Jedi Knight. Well, what's the point of being a Jedi Knight? Well, you do fight evil, but in the end, we see with Yoda that he becomes one with the Force, right? Or Ben becomes one with the Force, right? You become one with the, this energy field that inhabits all things. So the realization that is important to all heroes is that they need to become part of the superconscious. Now, in a story, the character might not realize that, right? The character might be looking for, the Holy Grail, or they might be trying to stop the bad guy, or they might be trying to get the girl, or they might be trying, I said the Holy Grail, so you might be trying to get some kind of treasure. But all of those things are metaphors for that thing that we really want, which according to Joseph Campbell is to become part of the superconsciousness again. So initiation is the process that you have to go through to realize that you are part of that you need to become enlightened and reintegrate with the superconsciousness. But then return is the phase of the story where, it's the very end of Star Wars, right, where Luke Luke has become a Jedi, and he sort of comes down and he celebrates with all of the people who have sort of overcome the evil empire. You can think of how Harry has these incidents where he's at the Dursleys at the beginning of the book, and he's at the Dursleys at the end of the book, and there are times when the sort of magical world kind of messes with the normal world that he's a part of. And in the 7th book, in fact, he doesn't even go to Hogwarts. He is still fighting in sort of that magical world, but he's outside of that sort of regular thing. So he's sort of, in some sense, become master of two worlds, right? He's trying to do this balance between the human world and the magic world, and he's trying to save both of them from the threat of Voldemort. And you can think of the return of all the hobbits to the Shire, and how everything's changed, and in the end, Frodo has to go off on the ship because he can't live sort of a normal life anymore. He's been so changed by the experience that he needs to go somewhere else. So all of these elements and all of these structures are useful. The reason we tell stories, the reason we're interested in stories, the reason we keep coming up with stories is because we really want to be a part of the superconsciousness, and the stories are a way of sort of allowing us to get there. All right. So now that I've talked about how Campbell breaks up the scheme, and I've talked a little bit about what that means, I want to talk about 3 other archetypal schemes and try to show you how some of the things that they're trying to do have something in common with Joseph Campbell's structure. So the first of these, I'm writing it, but I don't know if you can see it because it's very thin. It's Marxism. Okay, there's a common way of interpreting works that's sort of a Marxist way of interpreting works. And this is an archetypal scheme from the way that I see it. Marx's basic belief about the way that the world is structured is that you have 2 classes of people. You have the proletariat and you have the bourgeois, right? The proletariat are the workers, the sort of salt of the earth people. They're the good people, right? And the bourgeois are sort of the greedy people, but they own everything and they have all the power, and they oppress the proletariat. And so the hope of history in Marx's view is that eventually the proletariat will have an uprising and they'll overthrow the bourgeois, and that all of the property that the bourgeois owned will then be shared in common among the proletariat, and then we'll sort of have a paradise on earth. So when you look at literature through the lens of Marxism, it starts to sort of present, you can start to sort of think of things through this lens. Let's think about Luke Skywalker, right? Luke Skywalker is sort of a down-home, salt of the earth kind of guy, and the evil empire has all the power and is oppressive, and just, they want their way of existence to continue. And so clearly in Marxist reading of things, in Star Wars, the empire is a metaphor for the bourgeois, and the rebellion is there's your uprising, right? The rebellion is a metaphor for the proletariat. A second scheme we could look at is Jordan Peterson's maps of meaning. And in Peterson's mind, there are these 2 sort of forces in the world. There's chaos and order. And the meaningful is that space where a human being is sort of sitting. They're sort of on the edge of chaos, right? There's enough chaos that they're actually being challenged to bring that into order, but there's enough structure that they're not just losing their mind. So Peterson would look at a story like Star Wars, right? And you have this sort of tyrannical evil empire that's sort of taken over, and there's well, in that case, there's too much structure there, right? You've overcompensated in some way, and you need to have somebody come and bring in the right sort of principles so that there can be sort of a restoration of balance, right? And balance is a very common theme in these sort of big, grandiose stories that people are talking about. And the final one that I want to talk about is there's a certain kind of way of reading stories where everything is a Christian allegory. Right? Lord of the Rings it's very common to talk about Lord of the Rings as a Christian allegory, even though Tolkien said that it wasn't an allegory. Obviously, you have the long-lost king who comes back and becomes the true king, and then you have you have Gandalf being the Grey, and then he dies, and then he's resurrected, but now he's Gandalf the White instead of Gandalf the Grey. Excuse me. Superman is very commonly, there's a Christian allegory associated with Superman. Harry Potter dying and being resurrected, right? That's very fruitful. Christians will sort of see Christ in everything, and they will see anything of the hero suffering as Christ's passion. Having symbolism like the Eucharist and things like that is very common. So there's a way of looking at stories where you have sort of Christian allegory explaining everything. So Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, Marxist interpretation, Peterson's way of interpreting things through his maps of meaning, and Christian allegory are all examples of what I have called an archetypal scheme. Now, these things all have several things in common. First, they all assume that mythology, that whether that's a sort of cemented mythology from a culture gone by, or the mythology that sort of pop culture is creating, that's sort of the same everywhere. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. That these sort of categories, or if you have these other schemes over here in Marxism and Peterson and Christian allegory, they don't have these sort of 16 elements, but they have similar sort of structures that they apply and want to see things through the lens of. So they see myth as the same everywhere. Notice that in each of these, the value of stories, or the reason why stories exist, is because it sort of pushes us towards some kind of end, right? In Campbell's scheme, it's to get us to the superconsciousness. In Marxism, it's to sort of show us how the proletariat could have victory, or to show us how disgusting the bourgeois are. In Peterson, it's to help us find meaning, and in the Christian allegory, it's to point us to Christ. Finally, all of these works assume that an artist or an author or a storyteller is a conduit instead of an author, right? You can have a Catholic, monk write a story, and really what he really means is this sort of idea of getting back to the super consciousness. Now he'll call that God, right? But But really what he's talking about is this other sort of thing, right? If he insists on God being a personal sort of a particular kind of God and not sort of a symbol for the superconsciousness, that sort of underlying reality of things, then he's just not seeing what's really going on. Likewise with Marxism and maps of meaning and Christian allegory, right? An atheist can write a story, but because he has eternity written on his heart, as the argument often goes, he can't help but have Christianity and symbols of the Eucharist and so on sort of in there. Same goes for Marxism and maps of meaning, that these authors are doing what they're doing, and they may not even necessarily sort of have a purpose in doing what they're doing, but regardless, they sort of reveal whatever the metaphysics of each of these views is. So, in effect, the whole point of an archetypal interpretation is to present us, or is to find, right, if you're using this interpretation, you're trying to find the hero with 1,000 faces. That's the name of Joseph Campbell's book. But in Joseph Campbell's case, what are you looking for? You're looking for the superconsciousness. You may not know that that's what you're looking for, but this is what comes out of it, right? If you do interpretation correctly, you're going to find the superconsciousness, right? If you're a Marxist, if you do interpretation correctly, you're going to realize the proletariat bourgeoisie conflict and possibly, the paradisal promise of, the proletariat regime once the bourgeois have been thrown out. You're going to find meaning, right? You're looking for meaning when you look at stories and things. And in Christian allegory, you're looking for Christ, or you're looking for redemption, or you're looking for whatever sort of thing that this would lead to. So whatever the hero of your metaphysics is, stories just do that. So stories exist for you to confront that hero with 1,000 faces and wrestle with that hero. Now, there is an alternative, and that alternative is presented by mainly C.S. Lewis, but I'm also going to mention Tolkien because he has an analogy that I think is wonderful. And in order to talk about this alternative, I need to define literature the way that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien would define it. Literature is the obedient, active reception of an author's idiosyncratic logical, poetical, linguistic, written performance. Okay. Literature is the obedient, active reception of an author's idiosyncratic, logical, poetical, written linguistic performance. Now, that is a lot of stuff. So let me break that down a little bit. Linguistic, written, let's just start with linguistic, written. Okay, linguistic written is differentiating literature from other kinds of art. Okay, so you could have, painted draft, right? If you're talking about painting, or you wouldn't even have to have draft. You just have painted painted performance or painting performance. Okay. So you just fill in what kind of performance is going on when you have literature that an author's doing. They are writing something with language. Okay. As opposed to having a linguistic spoken performance. So if you have a storyteller just telling you a story and they're not writing it down and you're not interacting with words on a page, that would be a linguistic spoken performance. And maybe we'd switch spoken linguistic performance. Then I'm not sure what would make a more pleasing order. Okay, so we've got that section down. Performance. So there was a philosopher in this last century named J.L. Austin, and he wrote a book called How to Do Things with Words, and he had this idea of a performative. A performative is something that does something different than regular speech. So when a husband in a marriage ceremony says, "I do," he is doing something different than when his now wife says, "Do you want a sandwich?" And he says, "I do," right? There's a whole host of sort of contextual and ceremonial and moral things that are going on when he says, "I do" in the wedding ceremony than on the honeymoon when she's asking if he wants to eat a sandwich, right? There's just a lot more going on. So I would argue that all art ends up being performance, that there is something that you're doing that's different from other things, and basically it's that doing of things that makes something art. So there has been a question for a long time about what makes something poetry. And so, for instance, if you look at Walt Whitman will have a bunch of lists of things, like a grocery list, and people will look at that and they say, oh, well, poetic language isn't all that different from regular language. But the difference between poetic language and regular language is that Whitman is putting on a performance. He's creating a poem for you that has a list. And so you can't tell whether something is a poem just from its language. You have to know, you have to recognize that someone was making the thing. Okay. So hopefully that's clear. So then we have this phrase, logical poetical. And this is important because logical poetical, I mean in a very specific way. And these are terms that C.S. Lewis uses. So we have logos and we have poema, which are the Greek terms for logos means word or story or speech, something like that. And poema means poema. And poema means to make or construct. Or it's the word they use for poem, but it means something like made thing or shaped thing. So logos is what it says, right? If we look at a piece of literature, what is this work saying? What is it about? Poema is how it says it. Okay. So, for instance, the story of Harry Potter, right? What is Harry Potter about? What is a sort of really condensed summary of the story? And it's something like friendship and courage are more important than not dying. And you can see how Voldemort, the villain of that series, does all of the horrible things he does because he has no friends, because he thinks he's so exceptional, and he has a huge fear of death. And then Harry, who is the hero of the story, he has friends and he is not afraid of dying, and that's sort of what makes him a laudable character. So to way oversimplify the series, right? I know there is a lot more going on in the Harry Potter series than that, but basically, what is it saying? Poema is how it goes about saying that. So it is, it is significant that the book is broken into 7 books. It's interesting that the 7 books sort of relate to 7 Horcruxes. People have pointed out that in each of those books a character dies, and the point of a Horcrux is by killing someone you're making yourself immortal. So the story is sort of immortalized by being put into 7 parts. Now that's a little detail, and it's not super important, and it doesn't seem to be the most important part of the way that Rowling goes about structuring that story. But you can see that that is sort of a component of how the story was put together. It could have been one book, right? You could have told the story about courage and friendship being more important than the fear of death, or in one story, but she told it in 7, right? She told it in seven parts. Another structure that's underlying the Harry Potter thing is that she writes it around a school year, right? We have a magical school, and he goes to school, so you have sort of classes and things, and that affects sort of the dynamics of how characters act and so on, right? You could have a character like Snape interact with a character like Harry in a different story, but the fact that they are student and teacher, that Rowling has chosen to make their relationship in that sort of way at the beginning of the story has certain effects on what ends up happening. So poema is the structure of how you're doing things. Okay, so we have logical, poetical, linguistic, written, performance. So we have all of that. And then we have idiosyncratic. Idiosyncratic, I will talk a little bit later when we talk about the issue of thinking about mythology all as one thing. So the author's idiosyncratic, logical, poetical, linguistic, written, performance. So that's the author's side of the thing. That's how the text is generated. An author sits down and creates a idiosyncratic, logical, poetical, linguistic, written performance. There's another side of this. There's the reader. And the reader, in order to have literature happen, for Lewis, a text is not literature. Literature is actually you interfacing with the text, actively interfacing. You can't, all of the books that are on the shelves over there and over here, they're just potential literature, Lewis says. So in order to actually have literature, you have to have the obedient, active reception of that text, right? Which is the author's idiosyncratic, logical, poetical, linguistic, written performance. Okay, so obedient means you're paying attention to the cues the author's giving you. Active means that you're doing it, and reception means that you are receiving what they're doing rather than Lewis contrasts receiving with using it for some other end. So this is the alternative, and I would like to sort of further clarify what I mean by this definition and showing this as an alternative by now taking some of the ideas that I have developed and certain other ideas that I said that I would develop and critiquing archetypal interpretation. So I want to start by critiquing a straw man that actually exists. It doesn't actually plague good practitioners of these ways of interpreting things. But I have watched a lot of YouTube videos that try to sort of use the hero's journey to tell stories, and sometimes the structures that are being used end up being oversimplified. The person who's closest to this in the 4 that we have up here is Joseph Campbell, right? He has his 16 elements, and he works really hard to make sure that anything that would happen in the story would sort of fit into one of those 16 elements. But even so, he has to sort of he has to sort of allow for extra categories to pop up now and then, because those there are some things that happen in the stories that he sort of can't account for in these 16 elements. Like a recurring sort of motif of some kind, right? Why are there why the Holy Grail? Well, in some sense, the Holy Grail is the ultimate boon, but why is it a cup? And what does it matter? And so on. So, the folks who sort of oversimplify the way that an archetypal reading works are misunderstanding how symbols work. The dictionary doesn't actually encapsulate what words mean. It is sort of a signpost sort of guiding you towards the range of meaning that a word can have. And you have to actually pay attention to how a particular author uses a word in order to know what they mean by that word. So you can do the same thing with the sort of archetypal structures as you can do with words. You just go, oh, well, stories are limited to these kinds of things, and then you're very sort of limited in the way that you look at things, right? An example of this is when people just really want stories to end with a happy ending. The idea that everything has to end with a happy ending in order for something to be a good work is an example of this kind of oversimplification, right? Happy endings mean that the good guys won. That's necessarily kind of a good piece of literature, and if you don't have that happy ending, then something went wrong. But literature can say, it can say sort of, it can be a scathing commentary on things, even if the ending doesn't end up being happy. Okay, so with that straw man out of the way, I want to talk about some of the issues that are presented by the archetypal interpretations and how this understanding of literature critiques those. And we're going to get into this idea of something being idiosyncratic. Remember I mentioned before that one of the issues with archetypal interpretation is that they assume that all mythology everywhere is the same. And this is particularly evident with ancient mythology, right? We tend to think that Greek mythology was this set thing, and everybody sort of knew these stories, and the Battle of Troy, right? The whole Trojan War saga, from the interruption of Thetis's wedding by discord and throwing the apple of discord, and Paris picking the three goddesses. And if you're not familiar with that story, I'm sorry. All the way through, Achilles and the 1,000 ships sailing over and fighting the Trojan War, and Achilles dying, and the Trojan horse, and all of that stuff. We think of that as all one sort of set thing. And that sort of ignores how mythology happens. And the most obvious place where we see mythology happening is in our day. We are seeing a develop of a mythology, actually probably lots of mythologies in our day right now. So what is a myth? And we need to be clear on this, because most of the folks in here, most of the ways that people will talk about myth in here is it's sort of this dream that sort of crystallized through time. People didn't have the same sort of sophistication that we have now. They didn't have, literature as a genre sort of worked. They hadn't sort of worked on it for, millennia or whatever. And so they didn't tell as refined stories as we do. And so myth is just sort of like what emerges from their unconscious sort of working together a story. But that's not true. So there's a book by Rosemary Sutcliffe called Black Ships Before Troy. And in her book, she recounts, it's a great book, she recounts the Trojan saga that I just rehearsed, right? You start with the wedding of Thetis, and I'm forgetting Achilles' dad's name, and Discord isn't invited. She throws the apple. The three, Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite want the apple. They take it to Paris. Paris decides that he wants to give it to Aphrodite because he wants to marry the most beautiful woman in the world. That happens to be Helen. She's already married. He goes and steals her. The Greeks are outraged. They made this pact to all fight whoever stole Helen from whoever the adulterer was that came along. They all, they can't go because the wind is not favorable, so Agamemnon has to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia. They sail off to Troy. They're there for 10 years. There's lots of different battles. Achilles takes a hiatus. Diomedes has a great, he finally can show sort of his potential. A bunch of stuff happens. Patroclus volunteers to fight for Achilles in Achilles' own armor. Hector kills him. Hector takes his armor. Achilles gets new armor from the gods. He fights everybody, murders everybody, kills Hector. Also, he kills the Amazon queen. He kills he just kills a bunch of people. Finally, he gets shot in the heel, right, because he has the weakness in his heel, and he dies. And Odysseus comes up with this plan for the Trojan horse. They flee. They take the Trojan horse in, and then the Greeks come out and they sack the city, and everybody dies or is captured, and everybody goes home to Greece. Right? That's the story of the Trojan War, basically. That's the myth of the Trojan War, because we don't actually have any Greek sources that tell that whole story in one go. People are often surprised when they read the Iliad that the Iliad doesn't end with the Trojan horse. But the Iliad only takes place over like 2 weeks of the war, and that's the spot where Achilles takes a break, and then Patroclus fights for him, and then he dies, and Achilles takes revenge, and the end of the book is Hector's father coming and begging for Hector's body, and Achilles agreeing, and then Hector's father takes him back and buries him, and that's the end of the story. Now, Rosemary Sutcliffe has this incident, this story that she records in her book, where Thetis at one point is very afraid that Achilles is going to go off and he's going to go die in the Trojan War. So what she does is she puts him in a dress, she takes him to an island where only women live, and she sort of leaves him there in the hopes that the Greeks will not find him, and they will just go off, and he will not die, and he will sort of live. Now, that's not in the Iliad. So, and given the Greeks show up and they roll out the blanket with the different things on it, and it has the sword there, and Achilles picks up the sword, and that's how they know he's Achilles, is even though he's wearing a dress, and presumably that he's much more muscular than everybody. They have to do that trick in order to sort of find him. I am sure that the origin of that section is from a comedy. But Sutcliffe, in order to sort of tell the whole story, has to sort of flatten the tone of everything so that it's all, she's trying to make it sort of sound like Lattimore's translation of the Iliad. It has this very sort of repetitive, stark sort of tone to it. And so the comedy doesn't exactly fit in there. But if you don't play up what was probably played for laughs, with Achilles in a dress, then you can kind of make it work. So Sutcliffe's book highlights that you can sort of have an Achilles who's in a dress, and you can have an Achilles who just murders everybody, And then you can have sort of the Achilles from the Iliad who murders everybody, but sort of recognizes that murdering everybody might not be the thing that's going to sort of fulfill him. And we have examples of that in our culture now, of stories that are sort of evolving, right? If you think about Batman, Adam West's version of Batman is a sort of comedic, very silly, or Lego Batman. That's more recent, right? They punch people and you get kapow, like pop up on the screen. And there's even a joke in the Lego Batman movie about, I will punch you so hard that, the sounds will appear visually. So you have this very sort of slapstick Batman, which has bat shark repellent, and there's a very funny gag where he's holding a bomb. I think it's in the 1966 movie. He's running around and there's like a child in a carriage, and so he can't throw it there. And then there's a nun, and then there's a bunch of school children, and then there's and he just keeps running, and he's ready to throw it off the pier, and he looks over the pier and there's a bunch of ducks, and he says, "Some days you just can't get rid of a bomb." Right? So you have this very slapstick kind of Batman, this very silly Batman. And then, alternatively, you have a Batman that Zack Snyder's Batman versus Superman is largely based off of in Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, where Batman shoots people in the face with a machine gun. Right? And it's very bizarre. Well, I'll talk about that in a second. So, now that I've said all that, what is a myth? So you have Achilles and you have Batman. You have Achilles in a dress and you have murderous Achilles, and then you have Batman who can't get rid of a bomb and has bat shark repellent, and you have Batman who shoots people in the face with a machine gun. What do those things have in common? Well, they have what I think we should probably call the myth, right? The mythos, the Batman mythos, the Achilles mythos. There's some core piece of the character that is common to each iteration of that character. This is why it's important to realize that literature is an author's idiosyncratic logical, poetical, linguistic, written performance, right? It's idiosyncratic because Frank Miller's Batman is really different from Adam West's Batman, right? They're sort of unique. You can't make them jive together, even though at the core, the myth that informs both of them is the same. So, the trouble is, when you look at these, same thing for Achilles, right? Achilles he has some core of the character that allows for him to be dressed up in a dress, and on the other hand, it allows him to be sort of this, he murders everybody. So the myth is that core thing about the character that, or a situation, or it doesn't necessarily have to be a character. But whatever that core is, if you violate that core, then people take notice, right? This is the criticism that's leveled against some of the latest film renditions of Batman, is that he kills people, and people are really upset that he kills people. But sort of the first comic book that Batman is ever in, he mows down a bunch of gangsters with a machine gun. In Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, as I said, he shoots someone in the face with a machine gun, right? Like, Batman has killed people in the comics. As far as I can tell, Batman stopped killing people when Batman the Animated Series came out, sort of in the 90s, because it was a kid's cartoon and there were censorship issues with killing people. So, but note that when people say Batman doesn't kill people, what they're saying is sort of this core myth of the character doesn't involve this character killing people. Now, I think in the case of Batman, it's obvious that that's not true, because you can go find many, many examples of Batman killing people. And so that's not sort of, unless you want to sort of write off like the original version of Batman as not Batman, that is not fundamental to the character. I think Batman has something to do with sort of how someone deals with trauma and how they sort of use that to fuel them to be great in some sense. There's probably other things too, and you could make a list of these things. I'm not going to try to do that now. That's a very complicated sort of thing. Same thing with something like, Achilles. Achilles is sort of he's the best fighter. He's the doomed best fighter, something like that. Maybe it's more complicated. If we understood Greek, we could approach it with some more nuance or something. Spider-Man has something to do, with great power comes great responsibility, but it has to do with sort of science and scientific power. Spider-Man, as well as all of Spider-Man's villains, are all accidents, in some kind of scientific experimental setting. And, Peter's first impulse is to go use that power to become famous and make money and not be a nobody. And it's when his Uncle Ben dies that he realizes, oh, that's not the way that things go. And all of the other villains in Spider-Man sort of don't learn that lesson. Right, so you have sort of this basic core of a Spider-Man or a Batman or an Achilles that all are informed, that all inform each idiosyncratic iteration that an author might make. So when an archetypal scheme assumes that all mythology is the same, it just totally ignores those idiosyncrasies, right? We know what this thing means because that fits into the structure, right? But I would say that the structures, sort of the common structures, you can look at stories and see that there are things that happen, right? Over and over again. But I think if you told a story about Spider-Man going through those sort of story beats, it'd be a very different story than Batman going through those story beats. And that's because the myth that informs them is different. And to sort of reduce Batman or Spider-Man to the story beats they go through is to sort of ignore the actual mythology of the character. So hopefully I've shown you that mythology isn't the same everywhere, that myths are sort of this core group of characteristics that characterize usually characters. They can be other things, right? Famous like Excalibur is an example of sort of this myth. It's like the true sword or something, right? Like if Excalibur shows up in a story, really important sort of regal, probably British things are happening, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be a character, but there's this sort of core idea circulating that's the fundamental part of the myth, and it informs each iteration of the character. And people believe that because they criticize things that don't meet that core as they see it, right? I already gave the example with Batman. This is often the criticism that's leveled at The Last Jedi with Luke Skywalker, right? Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi is not Luke Skywalker from the original trilogy. Now, I don't want to talk about the ins and outs of that, but you'll notice that this kind of criticism is the kind of criticism they make. Like the core, they don't use these words, but the core of whatever this thing is, the myth is, has been violated in some way, and so I don't like it. This is how they talk about Superman, right? Zack Snyder's Man of Steel, and so on, right? Superman, that's not Superman. Superman doesn't kill people. People really don't like people killing people, apparently. But, right, so, and they point to other things that sort of don't fit the core of the character. But hopefully I've shown that myth isn't the same everywhere, that that core myth of something isn't always the same, and even if we went through the same story beats, it would end up being a totally different experience. Okay. So mythology isn't the same everywhere. Point against the archetypal interpretation. So earlier I talked about how, so another issue is the value of literature comes from its usefulness to the interpreter's metaphysics, right? If we tell stories and stories exist because, for Joseph Campbell, we're trying to get in touch with the superconsciousness. For Marxism, we're trying to overthrow the bourgeois. For Peterson, we're trying to find meaning. For Christian allegory, we're trying to discover Christ in everything. The issue with things being useful is that it assumes that art has to be useful. It poses a certain... it has a certain sense that in order for art to exist, it needs to sort of justify its existence. It only needs to be good. And I want to talk about an idea that Tolkien talked about, and that is the idea of the soup of stories. And that's related to this idea of poema. Remember that poema is how something goes about saying something, right? So we have arts that are only poema, don't have logos in the sense that I'm talking about it, right? Now you can stretch language and talk about what cooking says or what music says, but strictly speaking, those things don't have logos in the way that C.S. Lewis is talking about. They do have poema, right? You can make a healthy version of a mousse using sort of whey protein, healthy, I say, using, whey protein and skim milk and, egg whites and whatnot. And you can do it. And some people have probably figured out how to make them quite tasty. But there's a lot of ways of thinking about cooking and food in general where you say, oh, well, I have to justify eating this, whey protein Snickers bar thing by claiming that it's healthy, right? I tell myself a story and I say, oh, this Snickers bar is healthy. Rather than saying, I really want to eat a Snickers bar, and a Snickers bar being delicious is enough. Or a mousse that's like made with cream and egg yolks and, all of the sugar, right? That just uses all of the stuff that mousse usually uses. And it's fine to eat mousse just because it's delicious, right? Not necessarily all the time, not necessarily, it's not what you're sort of going to it's not going to be the basis of your diet, but food is made, like, part of the reason food exists is to be delicious. And it's okay to eat something just because it's delicious. And in the same way, you can have a story that's just a joke, or a story that's just trying to give you a particular kind of emotion, or a story that's that's trying to make you feel claustrophobic or something. And all of those are fine, right? Or a mystery. The issue with the idea that every story has to be useful for something, it just assumes that stories aren't valuable otherwise. And it assumes that, other people's experience and what an author is bringing to bear when they do this idiosyncratic, logical, poetical, linguistic written performance, that's not worth it in itself. That a human being making something is not worth our attention just by virtue of them being made in the image of God and being sort of sub-creators, as Tolkien talks about it. So this idea of the soup of stories is the idea that, there's this pot and it has all these ingredients in it. And some of those ingredients have been in there a long time, right? And some of those ingredients are recent developments, right? Magical schools are seem to be sort of a recent development. Even if J.K. Rowling isn't the first person to have a magical school in them, right? Like that's a thing that's very in vogue right now. My wife always criticizes me for watching new magical school things. So the archetypal way of looking at things would suggest that if a story weren't doing this, then it's not valuable. Or a story can't not do this, because it's just unfathomable to this kind of way of reading that literature could be valuable just as an end in itself, that moose would be worth eating just because it's delicious. Lewis has this line that he's talking about somebody sort of reading something that's light and fluffy, not in the sense that it's trashy, right? That it's nonsensical, but that it's just, a good farce. He will not munch whipped cream as if it were venison, he says, right? Don't try to take all of this substance out of things that are meant to be, airy and fluffy. And that's a lot of what this archetypal kind of reading does. A correlate to this is that the author is a conduit, not an agent, right? And it seems to me that like human agency is basic. It's Peterson wants people to sort of take stories and see what they're doing and then act on those things, right? They need to see that in order to create meaning, they need to be in that balance between chaos and order, and they need to sort of live there. And he's expecting them to take action. Similarly, Joseph Campbell wants you to become enlightened. He wants you to live in light of that truth, as he sees it. But somehow you are supposed to have some kind of agency, but the person who produced this work doesn't have any sort of agency. It's very ironic to me that Jordan Peterson really values freedom of speech and says that sort of the chief message, or one of the chief messages of the Bible, is the individual speaking truthfully. And yet he has a sort of interpretation which would say that the sorts of things that you can say are limited to the kinds of categories that his maps of meaning sort of structure sort of limits you to. So if the only kinds of things that people can say are limited by these kinds of schemes, how can people critique those schemes? How can people argue with those schemes? It seems to me that these schemes expect a certain amount of agency from the readers, but attribute none of it to authors. And that just seems to be, degrading the author. And all bound up with this is this idea that everything is just saying the same thing. Everything's saying the same thing, right? If you're Joseph Campbell, everything's about the superconsciousness. If you're a Marxist, everything's about the overthrow of the bourgeois. Peterson's, everything's about trying to get you to meaning. And Christian allegory, everything's about understanding Christ. But things don't mean the same things. People have different points of view, and they're trying to say something, and they say it in all kinds of ways. They say it just in argument, but they also say it through idiosyncratic, logical, poetical, linguistic written performances. And an allegorical scheme for interpretation just invalidates that. So, in the end, the alternative of looking at literature as the obedient active reception of an author's idiosyncratic, logical, poetical, linguistic written performance, it assumes that what we're trying to do is not to find the hero with 1,000 faces, but to become 1,000 different men. I'm borrowing other people's eyes, right? I'm obediently receiving what an author's doing so that I can see what they see, And that's how I become 1,000 men. I'm seeing the world through a lot more perspectives than my own. Okay. So whether we're looking for the hero with 1,000 faces or we're trying to become 1,000 men makes all the difference. Most importantly to our faith, but also to just how we view books in general. Now, I hope I've made it clear that not all literature, or let me just say, I don't think that all literature is equally worthwhile. Literature doesn't have to, not all literature is worthwhile, but it doesn't have to say what I want it to say for it to be worthwhile. It just has to have been said, it has to have been performed by someone to be worthwhile. And, you know, if it's said, if the logical poetical construction is, you know, there are degrees of how well people do that. But it doesn't have to agree with the way that I put the world together in order for it to be worthwhile. To believe that all literature exists to confront me with the hero with 1,000 faces is to believe that I already know what ultimate reality is all about. If you have the literature of the Bible being put forward by Moses or somebody, right? They're writing their narratives. If what they have to say seems silly or primitive to me under one of these archetypal schemes, it's because I know better than the Bible. Not because, as Paul says, the wisdom that he has is foolishness to those who are perishing. In the end, if I am looking for the hero with 1,000 faces, not only the Bible, but no book can actually teach me anything that I don't already know. But if the task of literature is to help me see through the eyes of 1,000 men, then I may be able to learn from all of those different people. Perhaps some of them have dreamed dreams and seen visions. Perhaps some saw the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. Perhaps some of those men saw his glory and wrote that we might believe, that we may receive life. Perhaps what those men wanted to set before us was life and death, blessings and curses. So I hope as Christians that we recognize two things. First, that man, created in the image of God, has created much that is worthy of our attention. Right? When people make idiosyncratic, logical, poetical, linguistic, written performances, those are worthwhile because men made them. Man has created much that is worthy of our attention, even if it doesn't lead us to life. Because man is worthy of our attention. It's not art that's going to save us. It's God. So we have to obediently let the authors of the Bible say what they are saying, how they are saying it. Just like we have to let any author who is creating literature, we have to let the authors of the Bible do that as much as any other writer. But since what the biblical authors are saying confronts us with the truth and a choice, we have to go further than to simply hear what they have to say, and we have to choose life that we might live. Thank you.